The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi as Admiral Kiichi Nagamo gazed through his binoculars at the endless Pacific horizon. It was June 4, 1942, and the Imperial Japanese Navy's most seasoned commander felt the weight of empire pressing upon his shoulders. 6 months after Pearl Harbor had catapulted America into the Pacific War, Japan's string of victories across the Pacific had created an illusion of invincibility that now demanded validation through one decisive blow. Vice Admiral Nagime's Kido Butai, the elite carrier strike force that had delivered devastation from Hawaii to Ceylon, steamed northwest toward a tiny coral atoll that most Americans had never heard of before this war. Midway Island, sitting like a lonely sentinel 1,500 miles northwest of Honolulu, represented far more than its modest size suggested. Control of this strategic outpost would extend Japan's defensive perimeter deep into the Pacific and potentially force the weakened United States Pacific Fleet into a climactic battle where superior Japanese training and tactics could destroy American naval power once and for all. The plan, conceived by the brilliant and audacious Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, was characteristically complex and ambitious. Operation Me would see Nagime's 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, approach Midway from the northwest while a separate invasion force approached from the southwest. The carrier planes would neutralize Midway's defenses. The invasion force would capture the atoll, and when the American fleet inevitably rushed to Midway's defense, Yamamoto's main battle fleet, including the massive battleship Yamato, would be waiting to complete the destruction of American naval power in the Pacific. As dawn broke on June 4th, the Japanese carriers turned into the wind and began launching their first strike against Midway. 108 aircraft dive bombers, high-level bombers, and fighters roared off the flight decks in perfectly choreographed waves. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the strike force toward the tiny island where American Marines and airmen waited behind hastily constructed defenses, knowing that the survival of their nation's Pacific strategy depended on their ability to hold this remote outpost. But unknown to Nagamo and his confident aircrews, American codebreakers had achieved what many considered impossible. Under the direction of Commander Joseph Rochefort at Pearl Harbor's Intelligence Center, American cryptanalysts had penetrated the Japanese naval code J-125 and discovered not just the target of Japan's next major offensive, but its timing and composition. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, had deployed his available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown to positions northeast of Midway, where they could launch a surprise attack on the Japanese fleet. The stage was set for what would become the most decisive naval battle in the Pacific War, where American determination and intelligence would clash against Japanese experience and confidence in a contest that would determine the fate of nations and reshape the balance of power across the world's largest ocean. The pre-dawn darkness aboard USS Enterprise was broken only by the soft red glow of battle lights as pilots huddled around ready room briefings, their faces grave with the knowledge that this day would demand everything they had trained for. Commander Wade McCluskey, leader of Enterprise's air group, studied the plot board showing the estimated position of the Japanese carrier force. Intelligence indicated 4 carriers, but finding them in the vast Pacific would require both skill and fortune. At 0430 hours, Midway's radar detected the incoming Japanese strike force while they were still 93 miles out. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll as every available American aircraft Marine fighters, Army bombers, and Navy torpedo planes scrambled to meet the threat. The defending fighters, a mixture of obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and newer Grumman Wildcats, climbed desperately toward the approaching armada of Japanese planes. The aerial battle over Midway was brief and brutal. Despite the courage of the Marine pilots, the superior Japanese Zero fighters and experienced aircrews carved through the American defenders. Captain Kirk Armistead led Marine Fighting Squadron 221 in a desperate interception, but the Buffaloes were outclassed by the nimble Zeros. Within minutes, 15 of the 25 Marine fighters were shot down, and the Japanese bombers pressed home their attack on Midway's installations. Lieutenant Tomonaga's bombers struck Midway's airfield, fuel storage, and command post with devastating accuracy. Smoke and flame rose from the island as American defenders scrambled to assess the damage and prepare for the anticipated invasion. But even as Japanese bombs exploded across Midway, Tomonaga radioed back to the Akagi that a second strike would be necessary to completely neutralize the base's defenses. This assessment would prove fateful. Admiral Nagamo faced a critical decision. Aboard his flagship, his first strike had achieved significant damage, but Tomonaga's recommendation for a second attack meant rearming his aircraft with land attack ordnance rather than the armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes needed for anti-ship warfare. Moreover, his combat air patrol was running low on fuel and needed to be recovered and refueled. According to naval historian Gordon Prange's authoritative account, Miracle at Midway, this moment represented the crucial turning point where Japanese tactical flexibility became constrained by operational necessities. At approximately 0715, Nagamo made his decision. He ordered his second-wave aircraft, originally armed for potential naval combat, to be rearmed with land attack weapons for another strike on Midway. On the hangar decks of the Japanese carriers, ordnance crews began the time-consuming process of switching armaments while fuel lines snaked across the decks to service returning aircraft. Unknown to the Japanese, American patrol planes had finally located their fleet. At 0552, Ensign Jack Reed, piloting a PBY Catalina flying boat, spotted smoke on the horizon and flew closer to investigate. His electrifying radio message reached Midway and the American carrier task forces. Enemy carriers bearing 310 degrees, distance 180 miles from Midway. The information galvanized American commanders. On Midway, every remaining aircraft capable of flight was hastily armed and launched against the Japanese fleet. Army B-26 Marauders, Navy torpedo planes, and Marine dive bombers took off in waves, their crews knowing they faced overwhelming odds, but determined to strike at the heart of Japanese naval power. Meanwhile, Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise and Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard Yorktown received Reed's report and immediately began calculating courses and speeds for their own airstrikes. The Japanese carriers, focused on their Midway operations, remained unaware that 3 American carrier task forces were closing rapidly from the northeast, loaded with aircraft and crewed by men who understood that this battle would determine whether American democracy would survive in the Pacific. The first American attacks from Midway began reaching the Japanese fleet at approximately 0700 hours, and they came in disorganized waves that seemed to validate Japanese confidence in their tactical superiority. Army Air Force B-26 Marauders, flying at wave-top height in a desperate torpedo attack, pressed through intense anti-aircraft fire and swarming Zero fighters. Major Lofton Henderson led Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241 in a glide bombing attack that cost him his life, but demonstrated the fierce determination of American aircrews. Each successive wave of attackers from Midway was torn apart by Japanese defenses. Navy Torpedo Squadron 8's detachment of 6 TBF Avengers attempted to penetrate the protective screen of destroyers and cruisers surrounding the carriers, but 5 were shot down without scoring a single hit. The courage of these attacks was undeniable, but their lack of coordination and the technological superiority of Japanese aircraft and anti-aircraft defenses resulted in devastating losses for minimal damage to the enemy fleet. Aboard the Akagi, Admiral Nagamo watched the uncoordinated American attacks with growing confidence. His Zero fighters had dominated every engagement, and his carriers remained undamaged. The brave but futile attacks from Midway seemed to confirm Japanese expectations that American air power, while numerous, lacked the training and coordination necessary to threaten the elite Kido Butai. As his staff officers celebrated each successful defense, Nagamo focused on preparing his second strike against Midway, while maintaining readiness for potential naval combat. But at 0800 hours, everything changed. A radio intercept from a Japanese reconnaissance plane reported American surface ships to the northeast ships that included at least one aircraft carrier. The intelligence struck Nagamo's staff like a thunderbolt. The presence of American carriers meant that Japan's careful operational plan had been compromised, and that enemy airstrikes could be incoming even as his own aircraft were being rearmed for the second Midway strike. Nagamo faced an agonizing decision that would be debated by naval historians for decades. His aircraft were in various states of armament, some loaded with land attack ordnance for Midway, others being switched to anti-ship weapons, and his first strike aircraft still recovering and refueling from their mission. To launch immediately would mean sending a partially prepared and uncoordinated attack. To wait for proper preparation would give the Americans more time to locate and attack. His fleet. The admiral chose to wait and properly prepare his strike force. Aircraft ordnance crews worked frantically to complete the rearmament process while fuel lines continued servicing returning aircraft. The flight decks of all four carriers became scenes of controlled chaos as bombs, torpedoes, and fuel created a deadly combination of volatile materials. Japanese damage control doctrine, which emphasized speed over safety, left these materials exposed on deck rather than secured in armored magazines. At 0830 hours, the first wave of American carrier aircraft began arriving over the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet approached from the south, flying obsolete TBD, Devastator torpedo bombers without fighter escort. Waldron had calculated the Japanese course and speed perfectly, but his slow, vulnerable aircraft faced the same odds that had destroyed earlier attacks from Midway. The 15 Devastators of Torpedo Squadron 8 pressed their attack with suicidal courage. Japanese Zeros dove on them like hawks on sparrows, while anti-aircraft fire from the screening ships created a deadly curtain of steel. One by one, the American torpedo bombers were shot down until only Ensign George Gay remained airborne. His aircraft damaged and his gunner killed, Gay pressed his attack on the carrier Kaga before his plane was finally shot down just short of the target. The heroic sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 appeared to be another Japanese victory, but their attack had drawn the Japanese Combat Air Patrol down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches temporarily undefended. Moreover, the constant maneuvering to avoid torpedo attacks had broken the tight formation of the Japanese carriers, making them more vulnerable to dive-bombing attacks that were about to arrive from multiple directions. At 0950 hours, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from USS Enterprise, spotted smoke on the horizon and adjusted his course to investigate. What he found would transform the Pacific War in a matter of minutes. The Japanese carrier force lay spread below him, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed, presenting targets so vulnerable that they seemed almost too good to be true. McCluskey's decision to follow that smoke plume would be remembered as one of the most consequential navigational choices in naval history. His air group had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour, burning precious fuel while flying on calculated headings that had failed to locate the enemy. The smoke came from the Japanese destroyer Arashi, which had been delayed while depth-charging the submarine USS Nautilus, and was now racing to rejoin the main fleet at maximum speed. The scene below was a dive bomber pilot's dream. The 4 Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were in the middle of launching their own strike against the American carriers, their decks loaded with fueled and armed aircraft. The earlier torpedo attacks had drawn all the Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches completely undefended. McCluskey split his force, leading half against the Kaga while instructing Lieutenant Richard Best to attack the Akagi with the remainder simultaneously. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's dive bombers from USS Yorktown approached from a different angle and began their attack on the Soryu. The Japanese carriers, caught in the vulnerable moment of launching aircraft with others spotted on deck loaded with fuel and ordnance, faced the nightmare scenario that their own naval theorists had long feared: concentrated dive-bombing attacks against undefended carriers. The American SPD Dauntless aircraft dove from 14,000 feet at nearly vertical angles. Their pilots fighting G-forces and anti-aircraft fire to deliver their 1,000-pound bombs with devastating accuracy. Lieutenant Best's bomber scored a direct hit on Akagi's flight deck near the island superstructure, while his wingmen planted additional bombs among the spotted aircraft. The explosions triggered secondary fires among the fueled and armed Japanese planes, turning the carrier's flight deck into an inferno. McCluskey's attack on Kaga was equally devastating. Multiple bomb hits struck the carrier's flight deck and hangar, igniting fuel and ammunition that had been left exposed during the frantic rearming operations. Within minutes, both carriers were blazing wrecks, their ability to conduct flight operations destroyed by the cascade of internal explosions that followed the American bomb hits. The eyewitness account of these attacks, as recorded in Walter Lord's definitive work, Incredible Victory, describes the scene as a tableau of destruction that seemed to unfold in slow motion as months of Japanese planning dissolved in flame and smoke. Leslie's attack on Soryu achieved similar results. The Yorktown dive bombers scored 3 direct hits on the carrier's flight deck, and like her sister ships, Soryu was soon consumed by fires fed by aviation fuel and exploding ordnance. In the span of 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier were transformed from instruments of Japanese naval supremacy into floating funeral pyres. Admiral Nagamo, watching from Akagi's bridge as his flagship burned around him, could barely comprehend the magnitude of the disaster. His chief of staff, Captain Tezero Aoki, urged immediate evacuation as fire spread through the carrier and secondary explosions shook the ship. The transfer of Nagamo's flag to the cruiser Nagara marked the effective end of Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific. Though one carrier remained to continue the fight, the surviving Japanese carrier Hiryu, commanded by Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, had been operating separately from the main formation and escaped the devastating American attack. Yamaguchi, recognizing that his ship represented Japan's only remaining hope of salvaging something from the disaster, immediately prepared his own strike against the American carriers. The Battle of Midway was far from over, but the balance of power had shifted dramatically in favor of the United States in those 5 crucial minutes that naval historians would later call the turning point of the Pacific War. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the carrier Hiryu, watching smoke columns rise from his 3 sister ships as they burned on the horizon. A graduate of the Naval War College and former naval attached to the United States, Yamaguchi understood better than most the strategic implications of losing 3 fleet carriers in a single morning. But the 50-year-old admiral also embodied the fighting spirit of the Imperial Navy, and he was determined that Hiryu would strike back with everything she possessed. At 10:40 hours, Yamaguchi launched 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters toward the American fleet, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. The strike had been hastily organized from aircraft that were available immediately, rather than the carefully coordinated mass attacks that had characterized Japanese carrier operations. since Pearl Harbor. But time was running short, and Yamaguchi knew that every minute's delay reduced his chances of inflicting meaningful damage on the American carriers. The Japanese strike found USS Yorktown at approximately noon, just as the carrier was recovering her own aircraft from the morning's successful attacks on the Japanese fleet. Despite the warning provided by radar and combat air patrol fighters, Kobayashi's dive bombers penetrated the American defenses and scored 3 bomb hits on Yorktown's flight deck. The explosions killed or wounded dozens of sailors and started fires that temporarily knocked the carrier out of action. But Yorktown's damage control teams, led by Commander Clarence Aldrich, demonstrated the superior American approach to shipboard damage control. Within 2 hours, they had extinguished the fires, repaired the flight deck, and restored the ship to operational status. When Hiryu's second strike arrived at 2:45 in the afternoon, this time torpedo bombers led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who had led the morning attack on Midway, they found what appeared to be an undamaged American carrier. Tominaga's torpedo attack succeeded in hitting Yorktown with 2 torpedoes, causing severe flooding and bringing the carrier to a dead stop. The veteran pilot, whose aircraft had been damaged during the morning strike on Midway, led his final attack knowing that his fuel tanks had been holed and that he lacked sufficient fuel to return to Hiryu. His sacrifice exemplified the dedication of Japanese naval aviators. But it also represented the irreplaceable loss of experienced aircrew that Japan could not afford. Admiral Fletcher, recognizing that Yorktown was severely damaged and might not survive, transferred his flag to the cruiser Astoria and turned tactical command over to Admiral Spruance aboard Enterprise. The change in command occurred seamlessly, demonstrating the depth of American naval leadership and the flexibility of their command structure under combat conditions. Even as Yorktown fought for survival, American search planes were locating Hiryu for a retaliatory strike. At 1500 hours, Enterprise launched 24 dive bombers led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, while Hornet contributed 16 additional aircraft under Lieutenant Commander Walt Roddy. The combined strike represented nearly every operational dive bomber remaining in the American task force. The American attack on Hiryu began at 1700 hours, with Gallagher's bombers diving through moderate anti-aircraft fire to score 4 direct hits on the carrier's flight deck. Like her sister ships earlier in the day, Hiryu was caught with fueled and armed aircraft on deck, and the bomb hits triggered cascading fires and explosions that quickly spread throughout the ship. Admiral Yamaguchi, realizing that his ship was doomed, chose to remain aboard rather than transfer his flag to another vessel. His decision reflected both personal honor and the recognition that Japan's carrier striking force had been effectively destroyed. As fires consumed Hiryu through the night, Yamaguchi composed a final message to Admiral Yamamoto. "We have done our best, but regret that we could not achieve more decisive results." Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive History of United States Naval Operations in World War II records Yamaguchi's final hours as emblematic of the Japanese warrior tradition that valued honor above survival. By midnight on Kun night, June 4th, all 4 Japanese carriers that had begun the day as the most powerful naval striking force in the world were either sunk or burning hulks awaiting their final plunge to the ocean floor. The Kido Butai, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months with seeming invincibility, had been destroyed in a single day's fighting by American carriers that many Japanese strategists had dismissed as inferior in training and determination. Strategic implications extended far beyond the loss of ships. Japan had also lost over 200 experienced naval aviators, pilots, and aircrew who represented years of training and combat experience that could not be quickly replaced. The United States, with its superior industrial capacity and training programs, would prove far better equipped to replace both ships and men in the grueling war of attrition that would Followed as dawn broke on June 5, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto faced the most devastating defeat in the history of the Imperial Japanese Navy. From his flagship Yamato, positioned 300 miles west of Midway with the main battle force, the architect of Pearl Harbor received a steady stream of reports that confirmed his worst fears. 4 fleet carriers destroyed, hundreds of irreplaceable aircrew lost, and the strategic initiative in the Pacific irretrievably surrendered to an American fleet that had demonstrated tactical superiority when given the opportunity to fight on equal terms. Yamamoto's complex operational plan, which had divided Japanese forces into multiple groups across thousands of miles of ocean, now revealed its fundamental weakness. The main battle force, including the world's most powerful battleships, had been positioned too far from the carrier action to provide support when it was desperately needed. The invasion force, still approaching Midway from the southwest, was now exposed to American air attack without the protective umbrella of carrier-based fighters. The Japanese commander faced an agonizing decision. His instincts as a naval strategist argued for pressing the attack with his remaining surface ships, using the superior firepower of his battleships and cruisers to engage the American fleet in a traditional surface action. But without air cover, his ships would be vulnerable to American carrier aircraft during daylight hours, and the loss of 4 carriers had already made this operation a strategic disaster regardless of any subsequent tactical victories. At 02:55 hours. On June 5th, Yamamoto issued the order that ended Japanese offensive operations in the Central Pacific. Retire immediately. The invasion of Midway was canceled, and all Japanese forces were directed to withdraw to bases in the Marshall Islands. The decision represented not just tactical prudence, but recognition that Japan's window of opportunity for decisive victory in the Pacific had closed permanently. The American pursuit was hampered by fuel considerations and the need to protect the damaged Yorktown, which was still afloat but barely seaworthy. Admiral Spruance, now in tactical command of the American carrier forces, demonstrated the cautious judgment that would characterize successful American naval leadership throughout the war. Rather than pursuing the retreating Japanese fleet into potentially hostile waters, he consolidated his forces and prepared for potential counterattacks. The final chapter of the battle occurred on June 6th, when the Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, penetrated the American screen, protecting the crippled Yorktown. Despite the efforts of destroyers USS Hammond and USS Hughes to provide anti-submarine protection, Tanabe's submarine fired 4 torpedoes at close range. 1 torpedo struck Hammond, breaking the destroyer in half, while 2 others hit Yorktown below the Waterline. The loss of Yorktown represented the final major casualty of the Battle of Midway. But unlike Japanese losses, American industrial capacity could replace both the ship and her aircrew within months. The carrier's sinking also provided a measure of satisfaction to Japanese submarine forces, though it could not compensate for the strategic disaster that had befallen the combined fleet. American casualties for the entire battle totaled 307 killed, including the courageous aircrew of Torpedo Squadron 8, who had sacrificed themselves to draw Japanese fighters away from the decisive dive bombing attacks. Japanese losses exceeded 3,000 killed, including Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Jisaku Okada of Kaga, who chose to go down with their ships in accordance with naval tradition. The strategic analysis contained in Gordon Prange's Miracle at Midway emphasizes that the battle's outcome fundamentally altered the Pacific balance of power in ways that extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. But the true significance of Midway lay not in the comparative casualty figures, but in the strategic transformation it represented. Japan's naval aviation capability, built over 2 decades of intensive training and combat experience, had been gutted in a single day. The United States, with its vast industrial resources and rapidly expanding training programs, now possessed the initiative in a war of attrition that would favor American material advantages over Japanese tactical expertise. The setting sun on June 6, 1942, illuminated American ships patrolling waters that had been dominated by Japanese naval power just 48 hours earlier. The ambitions of the rising sun, which had seemed unstoppable after Pearl Harbor, had indeed met their end beneath Midway's brutal, coordinated assault by American forces who had learned to fight with both courage and intelligence. The news of Midway's outcome reached Washington and Tokyo almost simultaneously, but the reactions in the two capitals could not have been more different. In the White House, President Franklin Roosevelt received the initial reports with cautious optimism that gradually transformed into recognition that American forces had achieved a victory of historic proportions. The president understood that Midway represented more than a tactical success. It had demonstrated that American industrial power, properly organized and directed, could match and defeat Japanese military excellence. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their experienced aircrew represented a blow to Japanese naval capability that could not be concealed from Emperor Hirohito or the Supreme War Council. Admiral Yamamoto, summoned to explain the defeat, accepted full responsibility while privately recognizing that Japan's strategic position in the Pacific had been fundamentally compromised. The Japanese response revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of their military culture. Orders went out immediately to suppress news of the defeat, maintaining the fiction of Japanese invincibility that had sustained public morale since Pearl Harbor. Simultaneously, crash programs began to replace the lost carriers and train new aircrew, but these efforts would take years to complete and could never fully restore the qualitative advantage that Japanese naval aviation had enjoyed at the war's beginning. For the United States, Midway validated the strategic decisions that had been made in the dark months following Pearl Harbor. The emphasis on code breaking, exemplified by Commander Rochefort's intelligence coup, had provided American commanders with the information necessary to achieve tactical surprise despite being outnumbered. The decision to commit all available carriers to the defense of Midway, despite the risks involved, had demonstrated American willingness to accept calculated risks for strategic advantage. The battle also revealed the superior American approach to damage control and industrial replacement. Yorktown's initial survival of bomb damage, followed by her rapid return to action, contrasted sharply with the catastrophic fires that had consumed the Japanese carriers. This difference reflected not just technical procedures, but fundamental differences in naval philosophy that would favor American forces throughout the remainder of the war. Perhaps most significantly, Midway marked the beginning of American offensive operations in the Pacific. The successful defense of the strategic outpost provided a secure base for future advances toward the Japanese home islands, while the destruction of Japanese carrier aviation removed the primary obstacle to American amphibious operations across the Central Pacific. The victory made possible the island-hopping campaigns that would follow, bringing American forces steadily closer to Japan itself. The personal stories of Midway's participants would resonate through American naval tradition for generations. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's navigation decision to follow the Japanese destroyer's smoke trail became a case study in tactical intuition. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8, though tactically unsuccessful, exemplified the courage that American forces would display throughout the Pacific War. Admiral Spruance's calm leadership under pressure established him as one of America's premier naval commanders. The comprehensive historical assessment provided in John Keegan's The Second World War identifies Midway as the moment when American strategic advantages began to overcome Japanese tactical superiority in the Pacific theater. For Japan, The battle marked the beginning of a defensive war that would gradually consume the Empire's remaining resources. The loss of experienced aircrew at Midway created a training crisis that Japanese aviation never fully resolved. Subsequent battles would reveal declining Japanese pilot quality as hastily trained replacements struggled to match the combat effectiveness of their predecessors who had been lost over the coral sands of Midway Atoll. The strategic balance established at Midway would govern Pacific operations for the remainder of the war. American industrial supremacy, protected by increasingly effective naval forces, would produce the ships, aircraft, and weapons necessary to sustain offensive operations across 6,000 miles of ocean. Japanese defensive capabilities, though often fierce and effective at the tactical level, could never again seriously threaten American strategic positions or interrupt the steady advance toward Tokyo Bay. As the sun set on June 7, 1942, salvage vessels worked to recover what remained of American and Japanese aircraft scattered across the waters near Midway Atoll. The coral island itself, scarred by Japanese bombing but still firmly in American hands, had become a monument to the turning of the Pacific War's tide. The Japanese ambitions that had seemed so overwhelming just 6 months earlier had indeed met their end beneath Midway's brutal, coordinated assault, changing forever the trajectory of the Second World War and establishing American naval supremacy that would endure long after the final surrender ceremonies in Tokyo Bay. The Battle of Midway had lasted just 4 days, but its consequences would shape the Pacific for generations to come.